Hello, everyone. Today I want to introduce you to a long, interesting, and frightening story in the genre of mystical horror. Make yourselves comfortable and enjoy. I wish you a pleasant viewing and listening experience. A family heirloom. My grandmother died when I was very young. I barely remember her, except for the faintest fragments. She always wore floral dresses and always gave me treats when my mom wasn't looking. My grandfather never remarried. My mother always said it was because he loved his wife so deeply that no one could ever take her place. When I grew older, that idea seemed both heartbreaking and romantic to me. My grandmother had her own room. Grandpa said he snored too loudly, so they had to sleep separately. When she died, he locked her room, and it became the only place in the house we were never allowed to enter. Sometimes we tried peeking through the keyhole, but someone would inevitably scream that they saw a ghost, and we would all scatter. I don't think my grandfather was lonely. We were a huge part of his life. He lived nearby, so we often crowded into his house, filling it with noise and life. I played in his garden with my cousins while the adults talked and cooked. In summer, the garden overflowed with flowers my grandmother loved, especially hydrangeas. In winter, it was covered with fat balls and bird feed, and the feeder was always full. Grandpa said Grandma loved birds and always worried they wouldn't have enough to eat when the cold arrived. I was unofficially my grandfather's favorite. He would lift me onto his lap and hum a little song about my name, one I didn't understand, but found hilarious. Lily Pink, Little Pink Lily. I got into the habit of wearing pink whenever I visited him. He took over my grandmother's role of giving us sweets, warning us not to tell our parents, though I'm sure they knew perfectly well, judging by the telltale chocolate smudges around our mouths. He was a gentle, short man who almost never raised his voice. The only time I remember him being even slightly angry was when my brother Craig and I got into a fight. Craig kicked me so hard on the leg that the sole of his boot left an imprint. Grandpa nearly shouted. Unaccustomed to being scolded by him, Craig burst into tears. Grandpa pulled him aside and gave him a long, serious talk about the importance of family. You don't hurt your family. Your family matters. After that, Craig always treated me quite well. When my grandfather grew weaker, he needed help. Since I was his favorite, a natural part of that responsibility fell to me. I shared duties with a caregiver, though to me they never felt like obligations. I loved him deeply. I would have done anything for my grandfather. His mind remained mostly sharp, with occasional lapses he called senior moments. Sometimes he called me by my mother's name, but always corrected himself. When he became seriously ill, I quit my job to become his full-time caregiver. Being sent to a nursing home was his greatest fear, and he made me promise again and again that I would never let that happen. I can't leave her. She's still here. We said, until death do us part, and I'm not dead yet. Even as an adult, I was never allowed to enter her room. He told me he had kept everything exactly as it was on the day she died, like a shrine to her memory. He grew weaker. He couldn't eat unless I fed him with a spoon. The nurse who came every day inserted a catheter and told me he really belonged in hospice, but I ignored her. If he wanted to die at home, I would keep my promise and let him. He enjoyed talking to me. He reminisced about the day he met my grandmother, the day each grandchild was born. He said he loved having so many grandchildren. He loved watching us grow and mourned the fact that he wouldn't live to see great-grandchildren. My oldest cousin was pregnant, but he likely wouldn't live to see the baby born. He was never sad. He had lived a full and happy life. But he grew anxious, even though he said he wasn't afraid of dying. He said he was worried about what might come after. In his final days, he was barely aware of what was happening around him. Family came and stayed as long as they could. Sometimes his small, modest room was packed with people, spilling into the hallway. The kettle was always on. The house was never empty, except for the night he finally died. I was with him, along with my mother and aunt. They fell asleep in their chairs, and their soft breathing was the only sound in the room besides the ticking of Grandpa's old clock and his slow, heavy breaths. He briefly regained consciousness before he died. And although I could have woken my mother and aunt so they could share that moment, some selfish instinct stopped me. Do you understand? I knew it was the end, and I wanted that moment to belong only to me. His eyes were clouded, but he managed to focus on me. His cheeks twitched as he tried to force a smile. Lily Pink. Yes. It's me. I'm sorry. I took his gnarled hand resting on the blanket. His fingers were cold. You have nothing to apologize for, Grandpa. I wanted to cry, but he had always hated seeing my tears. There is something to apologize for. He sank back into the pillow. The conversation had clearly exhausted him. I'm sorry for what comes after. You don't hurt your family. Family matters. Then he died, and only then did I allow myself to cry. I would miss him, but I couldn't grieve for him. After all, he would finally see my grandmother again after so many years. I imagined him strong once more, walking into white light and emerging on the other side into a garden where flowers always bloom and birds always sing, where my grandmother waited for him at the end of the path. As with caring for him, cleaning out his house fell mostly to me. I had help in the evenings and on weekends, but most of the time I was alone. His room was the hardest. I cried often while working there. It would have been poetic if the clock in his room had stopped when he died, but it didn't. It kept ticking, against my wishes. A constant backdrop to my routine. I packed everything into boxes, sealing and labeling my grandfather's life. Everything he had experienced was reduced to categories, what was valuable and what was not. The richness and experience of his life became objects to be sorted and stored. I separated items for charity, heirlooms to be divided among the family, memories to be boxed and sent to the attic. Everything I touched carried meaning. Whether it was the everyday debris of his life or relics of his history, a pen he would never write with again, a book he would never finish. These things were just as moving as his medals and photographs. There were old love letters from my grandmother, souvenirs from vacations, drawings we had made for him, greeting cards. And finally, at the bottom of an old commemorative tobacco tin, buried beneath movie ticket stubs and faded postcards, I found the key to my grandmother's room. It felt almost sacrilegious to enter it after all these years. But my childhood obsession with that room had never left me, and I couldn't have resisted even if there hadn't been work to do. From the way my grandfather spoke about her presence in the house, I half expected to open the door and find her there. Either as a dried corpse stretched out on the bed, or as a stuffed, mummified figure propped up in a chair. Of course, she wasn't there. The room was empty of both life and death, and had been for decades. It smelled musty, as expected, with a faint sweetness, an old scent that might have been violets, or perhaps roses. It was a very feminine room. The same floral patterns she loved on her dresses appeared everywhere. Grandpa had kept the curtains closed, so they hadn't faded, except for a narrow strip where a stubborn beam of sunlight fell across the narrow bed. My first thought upon entering was that it looked like a stage set. As if every object in the room were a prop. Did she die here? I couldn't remember what I'd been told. I caught myself searching for signs of her departure, of a life cut short in this very place. As with my grandfather's room, I didn't know where to begin, but this time because everything felt both familiar and unfamiliar at once. Here too were memories to be uncovered, buried just as deeply as the key itself. The first thing I did was pull the curtains open. With natural light, everything felt slightly more real, and I could look around without the dissociative haze that had come over me when I entered. I couldn't work on her room that day. It was too soon. I wanted a chance to remember more, to explore and reconnect with the woman who once held me on her lap. How could I open up this sacred life and fold it away in a single day? Even though she had died long ago, sorting through her personal belongings still felt like an intrusion. I went through her things with less sentimentality, but far more curiosity, than I had in my grandfather's room. Within these walls lived a beloved life I barely remembered. Every object carried a story, but I didn't know it. On one wall was a rack holding tiny baby booties. I counted them, the number matched the total number of grandchildren. She had kept a pair from each of us. We were also present in framed photographs, on the walls and on her vanity beside perfume bottles whose contents had long evaporated, and old makeup with faded labels. On the vanity stood a jewelry box that caught my attention. Its lid was inlaid with mother-of-pearl and sat slightly ajar. A string of amber beads spilled from it. The sight triggered a stubborn memory, me sitting on the lap of a woman who wore flowers and smelled like flowers, sifting through its contents. The jewelry inside was cheap, but bright and glittering, the kind of thing that would have enchanted me as a child. "You can choose anything you want," she had said. Anything at all. There was a butterfly brooch I suddenly remembered pinned to her dress, right in the center of a printed flower. As if it had landed there to drink nectar. I had an entire box of discounted luxury to choose from, but for some reason, that brooch stood out. "You want this one? Are you sure?" I saw a hand unfasten the brooch, carefully covering the sharp pin before handing it to me. It was made of enamel, with colored glass and poorly glued wings. Essentially, a piece of pretty junk. But it was the only thing I wanted. Whatever happened to that brooch? I wandered slowly through her room, examining everything, until the sky began to darken. The room felt peaceful when flooded with sunlight. But as the shadows grew, unease crept in. As a child, I had been afraid of the dark. Perhaps those feelings were returning because the last time I had been here, I was still a child. Whatever the reason, I left the room and locked the door again. That night, I slept poorly. I woke often, tormented by nightmares, and couldn't calm myself until I gave in to my old fears and turned on the lamp. In one dream, I unlocked the door to my grandmother's room. And from inside, I heard the sound of shuffling feet. I opened the door just in time to see something crawl beneath the bed. It dragged behind it a pair of deformed, not quite human, feet. In another dream, I tried to open the wardrobe, but I couldn't. It felt as though the door wasn't locked, but rather that someone was holding it shut from the inside. When I finally forced it open, my first instinct was to slide my hand between the hanging dresses. I touched something cold, papery and lumpy, something that could have been a face. It split apart a second before I woke up, and I felt teeth against my fingertips. In the last dream, my grandfather was there. He looked exactly as he had in the moment before he died, standing in front of my grandmother's door, blocking the way. He didn't react. His face was empty and motionless, his eyes lifeless. I couldn't bring myself to move him. The nightmares followed me into the next day, and it was difficult to unlock my grandmother's room. I had a bad feeling, something entirely separate from the usual nervous flutter I'd felt the first time. I heard no sounds. I saw no terrible creature scratching beneath the bed. And since I had left the curtains open the night before, sunlight chased away every shadow. It was a pleasant room, and I relaxed the moment I stepped inside. Dreams were simply my mind sorting through information. I couldn't allow them to affect me. I began working slowly, emptying my grandmother's wardrobe one dress at a time. I folded each piece with reverence. Even if I remembered little about her, she deserved the same respect as my grandfather. There were fur coats wrapped in plastic, and I wasn't sure what to do with them. I checked the pockets of each before placing them in a separate box. In one, I found a handkerchief. In another, a used tube of lipstick and an old penny. She had many handbags, and inside them I found even more outdated coins. In a small evening purse covered in glitter, I discovered a tiny key and set it aside, in case I later found what it belonged to. Around noon, relatives arrived to help. For some reason, I caught myself locking my grandmother's room and slipping the key into my pocket, unwilling to let them into our secret. And it truly felt like a secret. We carried boxes together and loaded cars, but all the while I wished they would leave so I could continue my exploration. I slept on the narrow bed in the small room I'd taken over since my grandfather fell ill. I hadn't slept well since I first dared to enter my grandmother's room. Though before that, I had always slept soundly. I had black nightmares filled with terror and confusion, waking drenched in sweat. I began sleepwalking, something I hadn't done since childhood. I often woke to find myself turning the handle of my grandmother's door, only to run back to my bed in childlike fear. In the morning, I would wash, dress, eat breakfast, and return to her room as if those dreams had never happened. I cleaned her room slowly and meticulously. I searched for the tacky butterfly brooch my grandmother had once given me, in case it had somehow returned to her room. It carried a familiar yet deeply unsettling association that wouldn't leave me. I dreamed of the brooch. It was a bad dream, but far more innocent than the others. In it, the brooch was pinned to my t-shirt, and someone was unfastening it. It was my grandfather. He saw it on me, and his face darkened for a moment. Something shadowed passed through his eyes. "She gave that to you." I was afraid. I thought he was accusing me of stealing it, and I began to cry. He lifted me up, kissed my forehead, and patted my back, but he still took the brooch away. In the dream, I felt awful. As though I had disappointed him. And I never wanted to disappoint my grandfather. He laughed and hugged me tightly, called me silly, told me I hadn't done anything wrong. But it didn't help. I clearly had done something wrong. It was written on his face. Voices were raised. I was alone. I stood before a closed door, listening. The doorknob was far above my head. What had I done? Why was Grandpa angry? I left my grandmother's jewelry box for last. Everything else had been labeled and packed, but I couldn't bring myself to put it away yet. Secretly, I hoped the butterfly brooch would suddenly appear inside, if only I looked often enough. I don't know why I wanted it so badly. Perhaps I just needed confirmation that my memory was real. Eventually, I packed the jewelry box with the other family heirlooms. I was exhausted. I no longer wanted anything to do with my grandmother's room. It was completely empty now, aside from the large pieces of furniture. The next day, a charity pickup was scheduled to collect them. I was finished. "We don't take mattresses." I was so sleep-deprived that the man might as well have been speaking a foreign language. He must have noticed my confusion, because he clarified. "We'll take the bed frame, but you'll have to dispose of the mattress yourself. It's unhygienic. People don't buy used mattresses." I shrugged. "Fine. Take the rest. I'll deal with what's left." He nodded. I turned and went back to my small room with the narrow bed. I didn't want to watch strangers trample through my grandfather's house. Stripping it of everything I'd ever known, turning it back into an ordinary place. I could hear the men joking as they moved furniture, laughing, talking about what they'd watched on television the night before. They meant no harm. But their lightheartedness irritated me deeply. The chatter only stopped when it came time to remove the old frame of my grandmother's bed. One of the men came to my room and knocked on the door. "Excuse me," he said. "You missed something while you were cleaning. A box. I thought you might want it." I opened the door. He was holding a large wooden box with a tiny brass keyhole. It looked expensive, almost certainly antique, and I admired his honesty. "It was under the bed in the room with the floral wallpaper," he said. "Honestly, you wouldn't notice it unless you crawled under the bed, but it looks important." I thanked him sincerely, turning his words over in my mind as I closed the door against the renewed noise. It had been under my grandmother's bed. I wouldn't have seen it unless I had crawled under there. Naturally, my thoughts drifted back to my dreams, and to whatever had slipped beneath my grandmother's bed, but they also returned to the tiny key I remembered finding earlier. In which bag had I put it? The men were not allowed to take any boxes marked with a cross. After they left, I finally allowed myself to search. I was certain the key was in one of the boxes. I went through each one as carefully as I could, trying not to disturb the order I had created. Every box contained countless strange containers, any one of which might have held the key to the polished wooden box now sitting in my room. But dusk found me before I found my prize. I ate a quiet dinner alone, then went to bed. I read a book on the mattress on my floor by the light of a bare bulb and eventually fell asleep. The dream I had that night was as unsettling as the others, if not more so. In it, I was still searching for the key throughout the house, digging through box after box. But in each one I found only knitted baby booties, packed tightly to the brim. Each emptied box deepened my anxiety, yet I persisted, stacking the booties in the corner of my grandmother's room until they nearly reached the ceiling. Just before I woke, I found myself racing through empty rooms in a panic over all the empty boxes. There was one box in my grandfather's room that I had not opened. Likely because of the figure crouched beside it, a hunched something that could have been a piece of furniture. But somehow, I knew it wasn't. And though I desperately wanted to look inside that final box, I didn't want to approach its obvious guardian. When I woke up, the first thing I did was go to my grandfather's room. It was full of boxes waiting to be distributed among relatives. But in the corner was one I recognized from my dream. There was no hunched figure beside it, yet unease still crept over me as I approached. The box was marked with a question mark, the symbol I used for items I couldn't immediately identify, and I began to sift through its contents. It took only a few minutes to find the tiny key, sealed inside an envelope labeled keys. I had labeled so many things while cleaning the house that it wasn't surprising I didn't remember doing this one. I carried the key to my room and unlocked the box. There was no ceremony. Perhaps I was about to uncover a deeply hidden family secret, but there was no thunder, no lightning. The box was filled with newspapers, yellowed and brittle with age. They weren't kept for historical value, they were crumpled, not folded. More like packing material than keepsakes. I dug through the box, pulling out the newspapers. I expected documents, photographs, maybe old diary entries. It won't surprise you that beneath them all, I found an old brooch. I realized I wasn't surprised. A part of me had expected it. What I hadn't expected was that the brooch did not depict a butterfly, at least, not as I remembered. It vaguely resembled one, with wings, and the color palette was familiar enough for recognition. But the creature it was meant to portray looked like nothing I had ever seen in nature. It was just as loud and garish as I remembered, but the clumsiness of its design felt intentional, not the result of poor craftsmanship. Despite being a physical object, its lines merged into a strange optical illusion. No matter how long I stared at it, it never quite came into focus, and it seemed to change each time I turned it. I slipped the brooch into my pocket. Relatives would soon arrive to collect the boxes, and I didn't want them to see it. Besides, looking at it made me feel strangely nauseous, like the onset of a migraine. We worked all day. By the end, the house was empty, save for my belongings and the mattress. My mother asked if I was coming home. She assumed I would. I didn't. I felt there was unfinished business here. One more night. I was so exhausted that I fell asleep easily. Before turning off the light, I looked at the brooch again, but learned nothing new. I placed it on the narrow windowsill beside me and slipped back into the familiar realm of my troubled dreams. Do you want this? Are you sure? I was little again. Sitting on my grandmother's lap. The jewelry box lay open on my knees, forgotten. The brooch on her dress was far more captivating. I remembered that part, but there was more I hadn't remembered, and now it unfolded obligingly before me. Choose something else, dear. This is for adults. I want this one. My tears came easily. I wasn't used to my grandmother telling me no. Please, Lily, anything else. Whatever you want. There was more pleading. Even as a child, I was a skilled manipulator, and I felt her resolve weakening. I sulked, pouted, begged, and cried until she gave in. Even then, she hesitated as she unfastened the brooch. You could have chosen anything, but here. It's yours. I clenched it in my fist, fascinated by the forgotten little face of the thing. A butterfly. Yes. A butterfly. A beautiful butterfly. Come now, Lily. Would you like a pastry? Grandma baked some. My mother looked horrified when I showed it to her. Oh God, where did she get that thing? Lily, give it back. It's disgusting. I didn't. It was mine. I had won it through persistence. My grandmother lowered her head. She wanted it. My grandfather noticed next. He looked angry. I thought he was angry at me for bothering Grandma, but he was gentle. He unfastened the brooch and took it. I followed him quietly and listened at my grandmother's bedroom door as they argued inside. The doorknob was far above my head. Their voices were muffled, but I caught fragments. Family must not be harmed. Hilda, I love you, but not Lily. She's a child. We agreed. No children. Not family. More indistinct words followed. It sounded as if my grandmother was crying. I'm so tired, she was saying. I asked for this. I begged. I pressed my cheek to the door to hear better, bumping my small childhood skull clumsily against the wood. The voices inside stopped abruptly. I didn't wait to find out whether either of them had heard me. I ran out into the garden to play with my cousins. Now I remembered everything, and yet it still didn't make sense. I don't think I was asleep. I could feel the pillow beneath my head, the blanket over me, even the tickle in my nose that had become a constant companion after all the dusty work I'd done. I should have been awake, but my bedroom door was open, even though I knew I had closed it. From where I lay, I could clearly see the hallway. Closest on the left was my grandmother's room, then my grandfather's. Straight ahead was the bathroom, and to the right, the staircase. A wide stripe of moonlight cut across the banister from the small window by the stairs and landed on my grandmother's bedroom door with frightening precision. I had closed that door and locked it. A ritual I never neglected. And I was glad I had, because deep within the familiar silence of the night, I thought I heard the floorboards creak inside her room. I closed my eyes and tried to fall asleep again. Perhaps the floor beneath my mattress shifted slightly, carrying vibrations through the long planks that made up the upper level of the house. But that was probably just my imagination. I listened to my breathing. It sounded loud inside my head and nearly drowned out the noise that became more noticeable the harder I tried to ignore it. A dragging sound. The sound of something that wanted to be heard but pretended it didn't. A sly sound, suppressed giggling, slow and labored, and it was getting closer. I thought of old children's songs. Hymns I had sung as a child in the large, echoing assembly hall. They taught us simple Christian songs, about Jesus being the light, about how autumn reminds us of God. I tried to remember the words. Anything, just not to acknowledge what I was hearing. It grew louder. More insistent. It sounded like the handle of my grandmother's door was being tugged. I didn't open my eyes. I didn't want to see the emptiness. And besides, the door was locked. No point in ruining my sleep by seeing something upsetting but harmless. Autumn days, when grass is jeweled with dew. Silk inside chestnut shells. Jet planes waiting to refuel midair. All the things I love. So I must not forget. No, I must not forget. Say thank you. I must not forget. The next verse mentioned bacon. I was sure of it. The smell of bacon. I didn't want to hear what I was hearing. The door I had locked opened with the shriek of protesting hinges, almost human in its complaint. A dull thud of something soft hitting the floor. That was when I opened my eyes. It was a mistake. Outside my grandmother's room was a thick shadow, partially obscured by the doorway. It had no real shape, but it undulated where it lay, compressing into something more rounded. It reminded me of a cocoon, as though something inside was struggling to emerge. The thin outer membrane bulged from within. It pulled itself free of the doorway. And now that I saw it, I was powerless to look away. I couldn't even close my eyes. I saw it, whatever form it chose to take. Its lower end narrowed into something that might have been legs, though they ended in points that bore no resemblance to feet. There were small protrusions, uselessly waving in the air as it shuffled forward on bent, sharp-angled joints that might have been knees. It began pulling itself across the bare floorboards, extending claws from its folds, driving them into the wood and dragging its body forward. Scrape after scrape, it came closer. Was this sleep paralysis? That would make sense. I'd heard all about it, and this fit the description perfectly. I couldn't move, and I was seeing something that couldn't possibly be there. As it drew nearer, I could hear its breathing, wet, gurgling, labored, thick with phlegm. It sounded like it was drowning, and I wished it would drown before it reached me. Beneath a hood of skin or fabric hanging from the front of the thing, a face began to emerge. I had no desire to see it. It crawled with relentless intent, crossing the threshold of my room and stopping only when it was within arm's reach. I couldn't close my eyes, but I forced them out of focus. There were tiny muscles I could still control, and I used them to blur the face approaching mine, letting my gaze wander. It smelled of mold, old semen, and damp dust. If cobwebs had a smell humans could detect, I thought, this would be it. A scaly hand touched my arm, scraped across my chest. It had a weight that contradicted its skeletal appearance. It used that hand to hoist itself onto me, and I let my eyes roll back. I didn't want to see its face. I felt its mass settle on my ribs. Pressure, like a concrete block crushing my lungs. Now it was breathing heavily. Breath that should have been hot but was icy, burning my skin. I thought of the smell of bacon as it pressed its lipless mouth to mine and began to suck. I must have lost consciousness. Or fallen asleep. Or slipped into another dream. I don't know which reality was real. I was dazed and dizzy when I came to, gulping air with lungs that felt flat, rubbery, and useless. I couldn't take a deep enough breath to satisfy myself. The creature was gone, if it had ever been there at all. But in its place, I felt a gentle pressure near my legs, enough to make me crane my neck that way. A man was sitting on my mattress, legs tucked awkwardly beneath him. I wasn't afraid. I recognized my grandfather from photographs of him when he was younger. He looked very sad. "I'm sorry, Lily," he said. "I tried to get rid of it, but she wouldn't let me. I tried to hide it better, but I didn't know I'd get sick so quickly. I tried to sit up, but I was so weak my arms buckled beneath me." I heard my grandfather click his tongue sympathetically. "Poor girl. It's unpleasant, I know. She told me everything about it. For decades it chased her. Sometimes she managed to get rid of it for years, other times, only for days. It exhausted her." He patted my leg. I felt it through the blanket. "She never wanted to pass it on to you. We had an agreement. No children. No family. She swore it, but she grew tired." He leaned closer, and I managed to lift my head enough to see him. His eyes were wet, and though they held sympathy, there was no real help in them. "I can't stay long. They'll notice I'm gone. But buy yourself oxygen. You'll need it in the mornings. Take a sip or two when you wake up. It's yours now, so take as much as you can. Pass it on if you feel able. Right now you probably don't, but in a few years, you might change your mind." It weighs on the soul, she used to say. I wanted to speak. I wanted to ask him so many things. But I had no strength, and now he looked afraid. I have to go. They're looking for me. I'm so sorry, Angel. Just remember what I said. Its sigil guides it. It must follow, but it always returns when a soul leaves. Sleep well, Lily Pink. Then he was gone. Gone, dissolving into the air without any dramatic effect, right where he had been. I was left alone with a new dilemma. For now, I decided I would endure the creature as long as I could. After that, who knows? Someone has to own it. A year has passed since my grandfather died. A year in which I learned more exhaustion and terror than in all the years of my life combined. It took me far too long to heed my grandfather's advice and buy oxygen. I didn't want to go to a doctor. I knew they wouldn't find the cause of my condition, and foolishly assumed I couldn't simply buy oxygen without a prescription. But after months of profound exhaustion, desperation led me to a website where I purchased several canisters without a single question asked. It seems no one cares if you buy oxygen. It helped. In a way. But only the way wiping your hands with a damp towel helps, better than nothing. Though I suppose I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start with the morning after my first visitation. I might have believed it was simply a vivid nightmare, despite my exhaustion. There was one unframed mirror left in the house, screwed above the bathroom sink. I shuffled toward it on legs that felt heavy and clumsy. There were dark circles beneath my eyes that hadn't been there the day before. Fine lines around my mouth, two new additions. I stared at myself for a while, trying to process what I was seeing, trying to make sense of it. But my mind was as sluggish as my body. Every breath was an effort. Every thought dim and hard-won. Eventually, I staggered back to the mattress and slept another 5 hours. By the end of that substantial sleep, I felt only slightly more alert than before. I didn't wake on my own. My phone woke me, ringing beside my head, vibrating against the bare floorboards. And it wasn't the first call. Judging by the missed call log, I had slept through 4 others. It was my mother, worried and anxious. She had no idea what I'd been through, but she knew how close I'd been to my grandfather. My sudden radio silence had frightened her. She asked if I was ready to come home. She had to repeat the question several times before I understood it. But once it pierced the slack mush my brain had become, I latched onto it immediately. The house where I'd once felt so safe, so welcome, had become a landscape of half-remembered nightmares. I desperately wanted to go home. I must have fallen asleep again, because the next thing I remember is my mother leaning over me, shaking me as gently and insistently as she could. I managed to mumble something about the flu, a quick lie, all things considered, and let her take over. I'm over 20, but there's something deeply comforting about relinquishing control and letting your parents care for you, even when you're an adult. My mother packed my few belongings. My father carried my things to the car. I was led outside on legs that felt like cotton, and the sound of the front door closing behind me was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. I was ready to be coddled and taken care of. And as soon as I was back in my old room, surrounded by my old stuffed animals and the familiar environment, I felt something inside me loosen. An anxiety I hadn't even realized I was carrying slipped away like a severed balloon string. I collapsed onto my old bed with a relief I can't properly describe. I slept again. It felt as though I could never sleep enough. When I woke up, the sunlight filtering through the curtains had noticeably dimmed. But I could hear a television playing somewhere in the house, and artificial light traced a rectangle along the edges of my door. I was home. I wasn't alone. I fell asleep again without any fear. That fearlessness didn't last long. When I woke again, the television was silent and the lights were off. My room was dark, save for the yellow glow of a lone street lamp slipping through the gap in the curtains. I could hear my father snoring, a sound that was familiar and should have been comforting, if not for the other sound I heard. It was a sly shuffling. Somehow both wet and dry at the same time, accompanied by a leathery slapping sound I remembered from the night before. I couldn't move, but this time, thankfully, I had enough control to close my eyes. I lay there waiting as the noise grew louder, closer. The song that had comforted me before faltered in my mind. The words blurred and became indistinct, and I tried to think of another as I heard the handle of my bedroom door rattle. A flood of scattered thoughts rushed through my head as the door swung open. The strongest of them was that I was stupid. Stupid to think I could leave this thing behind simply by changing locations, when I could feel the ugly brooch burning into my thigh through the pocket of my jeans. Stupid. Stupid. I tried to relax, but the terror was just as sharp as before. The mere presence of the creature dried my mouth and filled my eyes with tears. It made my heart thrash against my ribs, my pulse frantic and wild. My lungs were already tightening in anticipation, knowing what was coming. By the time it settled onto my chest, stealing the last scraps of air I had left, I could barely breathe. It was hungry. Greedy. Relentless. And as my mind drifted along the edge of consciousness, I heard its rasping voice burrowing into my brain until it itched. Words that were neither English nor even human, yet I almost understood them. I was closer to this creature than I had ever been to another person. Close enough to hear its thoughts. And as much as I hated it, I almost felt a sense of completion. It loved me. The creature loved me with a twisted, possessive love that didn't care about destroying everything that made me who I was. I belonged to it, and it was pleased. The knowledge that I hadn't escaped my fate came before conscious thought when I woke. Before any other realization, I knew I was entangled in something incomprehensible, and despite my exhaustion, I was ready to do something about it. It was late morning, nearly noon, and when I stumbled into the kitchen, my father made some comment about the late hour, like fathers tend to do. I didn't fully register his words, but I understood the tone, and I understood my mother's tone when she scolded him. I didn't care. I think I managed to string together a few words, asking to be taken back to my grandfather's house, and managed to deflect the inevitable questions with simple confusion. I sat at the table and waited while my father finished his lunch, then let him lead me to the car. I was wearing the same clothes as days before. The same jeans and top. Even the same shoes and socks. I hadn't changed anything, and the brooch was still in my pocket. I had been lying on it when I woke, and it must have pressed itself into my flesh, leaving a perfect outline. A disgusting thing. I made my father wait outside while I opened the door to my grandmother's room. It was completely empty now. Even the curtains were gone, and dust motes drifted and swirled in the sunlight cutting through the void. Something primal had brought me here. I didn't even have to look for the loose floorboard where her bed once stood. I pried it up with my fingernails, ignoring the splinters piercing my skin, and placed the cursed brooch into the dust-filled gap. It settled there. The screaming colors of glass and metal dulled only slightly, and I pressed the floorboard back into place with grim satisfaction. Let someone else find it. Let the new owners deal with it. My father drove me home, silent, as fathers often are, asking no awkward questions. I slept the rest of the day while the world continued on around me. Stupid. Stupid. It follows its talisman. But the talisman isn't only physical. I owned it again. Now I know that. Before, my grandfather had taken it back, returned it to my grandmother. Back then, I did not own it. And when my grandmother died, who knows what became of the creature? It must have drifted all those years, belonging to no one and possessing no one. I hope it suffered. I hope it suffocated every night, unable to find a new victim, choking on its own helplessness. I hope it withered and faded, its lungs shriveled, gasping in some endless void with every labored breath. I hope it was in pain every second of its existence, because when I found the brooch again, when there was no one left to claim it, that was the moment it became mine once more. It remembered me. And now I carried the same curse my grandmother once bore. I stayed with my parents for several more days, until my mother's questions became unbearable. My father, of course, noticed my decline, but he said nothing, only watched me across the kitchen table with growing concern. I knew that eventually he would be forced to speak. And I couldn't allow that. I couldn't answer the probing questions. I knew I needed to move out. To find a place of my own. But the swampy haze of my exhausted mind struggled to even grasp the concept of searching for a new home. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, my problem solved itself without any effort on my part. While most of my grandparents' belongings were divided evenly among their surviving children, my grandfather had left the house to me. To the rest of the family, this may have seemed strange or unfair, but in the end I was the favorite granddaughter, of course, and no one demanded an explanation. Only I knew the real reason. My parents helped me move my bed and few remaining belongings back into my grandfather's house. They were worried, my health had clearly deteriorated, but they didn't make a scene. There was an unspoken sense of relief. Not relief at being rid of me, but relief at being rid of the thing that followed me. Whether they understood it or not, it affected them on a very primal level. I felt relief too, in my own way. I was too tired to deal with questions followed by unsolicited advice about drinking more water, taking vitamins, or doing yoga. I wanted to waste away alone until I figured out what to do. I set up camp in my old room, but it wasn't ideal, even under such horrific circumstances. Every night I listened as it opened the door to my grandmother's bedroom and clumsily made its way to where I lay. The terror never diminished, whether it was the 100th time or the 300th. I felt the same fear every time. It never changed. Each night I was a virgin sacrificed to its hunger, and the horror was just as fresh every single time. So I moved the bed. I dragged it into my grandmother's room by myself. It took the entire day, with frequent breaks to rest. But by the time the sun began to set, I had positioned it beneath the window, exactly where my grandmother's bed had once stood. Lying there as sleep overtook me was the bravest thing I had ever done. I knew where it came from now. And in the strangest way, that made it better. It took the creature only moments to crawl out from beneath my bed and settle on my chest. Where before I had to listen to it scrape and drag itself toward me while tension built as I lay frozen and helpless, now it was over almost as quickly as it began. I blacked out nearly instantly when it began to feed, and woke with limp, useless lungs. At least now the endless, horrifying journey was shorter. It was the closest thing to peace I had felt in a long time. When I could think, I tried to remember what my grandfather had said. I tried to recall every overheard conversation, clinging to any hint. Once I had oxygen to revive myself in the mornings, thinking became easier. And I remembered something. I could pass it on. That knowledge sustained me for a while. It was my lifeline. I thought about people who deserved such a curse, bullies from school, customers from my service job, ex-boyfriends who didn't understand the word no. There were plenty of people in the world who deserved the fate I endured. Some of the boxes I had packed and sent away somehow returned to me. Visiting relatives left them on my doorstep when I couldn't, or wouldn't, answer the door. I sorted through them when I had the strength. There were many old photographs of our ancestors, black and white and sepia-toned. Our family was mostly women. I think I had always known that, but seeing it made it real. There were far more women than men. Strong women with severe faces. And on many of them, on the sternest women, a brooch was pinned to their chest. I knew that brooch. I had lost it and found it, hidden it and reclaimed it. It was mine. Something in my bloodline, some ancestral force, had made us ideal vessels. It told me this every night when it came, tender and cruel, draining my life in a language only I could understand. Other victims broke quickly. They either died of exhaustion or took their own lives. But not my family. We were strong enough to endure it. There was nothing noble in that, but I was proud anyway. Maybe because I needed something to cling to in order to keep living. One morning found me standing in my new garden. I don't remember how I got there, and I wasn't dressed for being outside, but I didn't care. It was badly overgrown, and I felt a brief pang of guilt seeing my grandfather's beloved garden neglected. Only brief. I placed the brooch on the bricks of the barbecue pit my grandfather had built. The grill was rusted now, but the bricks were as solid as the day they were laid. The weak autumn sun caught on the jagged shards of the ugly brooch, casting sickly, distorted streaks of color that cut into my inflamed eyes. I didn't care. I held a large, sharp stone, apparently torn from a flower bed, raised above the brooch. One side of the stone was dark with rich, fertile soil. I flipped it so the dry side faced down. The jagged edge hovered over the unnatural ornament. It was a weapon in my hands, as hard and cruel as the thing that fed on me. I may have hesitated. I may have questioned myself, wondered if this was reasonable. I don't remember. All I know is that I hesitated only a moment before bringing the stone down. The brooch jumped at the impact, rattling on the bricks and leaving a faint pale mark. The pin snapped easily, but the enamel and glass did not crack. I adjusted it with a clumsy hand and struck again. The metal bent slightly, but the structure held. Again and again I repositioned the brooch and struck it. Again and again it refused to yield. The most damage I caused was a nearly invisible hairline crack along part of the enamel. And then a sharp, searing pain shot through my arm from fingers to shoulder, leaving it completely numb. If I had believed success was possible, would have kept going, pain be damned, until it was reduced to colored dust and I lay writhing on the ground. But I knew it was useless. I threw the stone aside and picked up the brooch. The pin was broken, but I spent half an hour digging out glue and repairing it, even as I cried. I couldn't destroy it. My only option was to pass it on. There were too many people in the world who deserved this fate. Far too many. I needed to find them. I knew it wouldn't release me, but it might give me a reprieve. My first attempt came at a high school reunion. Under normal circumstances I wouldn't have gone, but my memories of school were vivid, and the suffering I endured there was not forgotten. I became an admin of the reunion Facebook page and suggested a secret Santa, making it seem like someone else's idea. Christmas was close enough that people accepted quickly. Choosing a victim took only minutes. A man named Patrick, an aspiring sexual predator back then, now somehow a respectable man. He had a wife. Children. I didn't care. I remembered him too well. I rigged the draw so he was mine and wrapped the brooch with barely restrained glee that should have worried me, but didn't. I even laughed, imagining his wife and children sleeping peacefully while he struggled and suffocated under the weight of my grotesque companion. I remember little of the evening. I remember the looks people gave me. I couldn't blame them. I was gaunt, pale, paper-thin, with streaks of white hair at my temples. I looked so sick that I heard people whispering, wondering if I was terminally ill. I laughed. Life itself is a terminal disease. What I remember most clearly is Patrick opening his gift. His face froze in polite horror he didn't bother to hide. If it had merely been ugly, he would have joked. But the brooch strangled the words in his throat. He looked disturbed. Uncomfortable. I was pleased. I left without opening my own gift. I left it unopened on the floor by my chair and called an Uber home. Once in bed, I fell asleep quickly. I do that every night, but this time, there was no scraping beneath my bed as I drifted off. The silence was the most comforting sound I had ever known. But sometime during the night, I jolted awake, trying to turn my head to check the time. I couldn't move. The realization filled me with such despair that I would have cried if I had the strength. Something opened the door to my grandmother's room, now my room, and scraped its way toward me. It made a sound I had never heard before. A wet, bubbling gurgle that grew louder until it whispered directly into my ear. It laughed in its own twisted way. Something was pressed into my limp hand. And even though I couldn't see it, I recognized the angles of the brooch without looking. My tormentor climbed onto my chest, slipping one arm beneath my head to lift it slightly, and as it began to feed, it transferred its knowledge to me through its own form of psychic connection. It didn't want to give me hints, it wanted me to understand the details of my failure. I saw Patrick pulling the brooch from his pocket as he left the reunion and throwing it into a trash can near the school while he waited for his Uber. Was it really that easy for him? How was that possible? He had owned it. I tried again. Any noble thoughts about bearing the curse and suffering alone had long since abandoned me. I gave the brooch to many people during the Christmas season, and afterward. It always came back. A pattern formed, but I was too exhausted to see it. Once, I even gave it to a homeless man who was begging for change. That was the only exchange that stabbed me with guilt. The others I tried to burden with the brooch and its keeper had wronged me in one way or another. This man hadn't. But I was desperate. His face twisted when he saw what I gave him, and he recoiled with a sharp, jerking motion that must have been involuntary. He quickly corrected himself, shaking his head, then accepted it anyway, turning it over in his hands with an expression of frightened awe. "What is this?" "I don't know," I said. "I found it. It must be worth something." He nodded, seemingly satisfied, though I doubt he truly heard me. "It's awful," he said quietly. "I know." He shrugged and slipped the brooch into his pocket. "Thanks," he said uncertainly. I walked away. I didn't expect much after my previous failures, and despite the fact that he had accepted it, the homeless man was not destined to become the brooch's new keeper. It was returned to me by the creature's own hand, as always. The cycle continued. You might think I never discovered the secret to passing on the brooch. I did. It took far too long, but I figured it out. My first real reprieve came in the form of a young goth guy with lip piercings, painted nails, and white contact lenses. A beautiful creature. He approached me on the street as if pulled by an invisible thread. I had taken to wearing the brooch openly. Why not? It sat on the lapel of my coat, and the warped part of me that hadn't existed before enjoyed the looks of disgust and unease it provoked. But not from him. His eyes widened, his lips stretching into a smile as he stepped closer. "What is that?" "A family heirloom." "It's horrible," he said, his voice almost tender with reverence. "I've never seen anything like it. Can I take a photo to show my girlfriend?" He already had his phone out. I smiled. "You could take it with you instead, if you want." His eyes widened even more. "Well, I can't just take a family heirloom." The hunger in his gaze was sharp. And before I realized what I was doing, I was unpinning it. "You can. It goes where it's wanted. That's how my family got it. My grandmother always said it goes where it's needed. And if someone ever wants it, I should give it to them." He absorbed my lie with a thoughtful expression. "If you're sure." "I'm sure." He took it from my open palm. And in that moment, I knew. You have to want it. That's the key. Giving it against someone's will is useless. I'd tried slipping it into open bags or accessible pockets before, it didn't count. You must desire it. It's been 2 months since the boy took it from me. My sleep has been deep. My health has flourished. I haven't touched oxygen in weeks, and when I looked in the mirror this morning, the face looking back at me was fresh, young, and healthy. But I know it won't last. I can already feel the itch at the base of my skull, the thoughts of my monster, preparing to return. Its food source is running dry. This time, I know what to do. I've already set up a seller account on eBay, selling off the rest of my grandmother's jewelry alongside items I've picked up from thrift stores. Business is good. The brooch is strange and ugly, but I know it will resonate with someone out there. And now I have a global platform. When the sweet boy is gone, others will come to take my burden, for a while. Outro/commentary, translated. So that's the story, guys. What did you think? Be sure to write your thoughts in the comments. And now I want to make an important announcement. I want to give a huge thank you to the guys from the channel Archive number 7 for taking part in the voice acting and absolutely nailing their roles. Seriously, thank you so much. By the way, I also took part in voice acting on their channel, so be sure to check out their video, the link will be in the description, and leave them a nice comment. Now, a few thoughts about the story as a whole. In short, I liked it. It's really cool to see how the character develops, from an empathetic, caring girl who deeply loves her grandparents, curious in a childlike way yet independent, to someone completely broken, exhausted, and indifferent to other people. She's willing to do anything to get rid of the curse. Not just pass it on to people who wronged her, but to anyone who wants it. You can feel how relieved she is when she finally succeeds. Especially with the goth boy who genuinely desired the brooch. And honestly, no one knows how they'd act in her place. After years of suffering like that, many of us might do the same. Overall, yeah, this fits the classic description of sleep paralysis almost perfectly. If you look it up online, you'll see images of dark figures sitting on people's chests, crushing them, making it hard to breathe. I actually had a similar experience when I was little, around 6 or 7. The same nightmare repeated for about a week. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, or maybe it was still a dream, and see this huge black thing on the ceiling, with an unnatural head, speaking in some strange language that I somehow understood. It scared the hell out of me. I even remember seeing it once on the stairwell of my apartment building when I was coming home from school. Looking back, it's terrifying how real it felt. If you've had similar experiences, share them in the comments. Sleep paralysis stories are always interesting to read, and I'm sure most people have experienced something like this, whether they remember it or not. So yeah, write your thoughts, leave a like, subscribe to the channel. I read every comment. Even if it feels like I don't, I really do. Thanks again for watching. See you next time.